You know, we tend to think of wetlands and marshes as nature's sponges, right? There are protectors soaking up floods, but what if that's only half the story? Today we're going to dig into the work of Crispulo Marrero to uncover the hidden dangers lurking in the very ground we think is safe. We're talking about the deep and often ignored concept of water risk.
Okay, so let's start with this incredible piece of ancient wisdom. The Japanese looked at a winding river and saw a dragon. The inside curve, the calm part, that was its belly, a safe place to build. But the outer bank, the dragon's back, that's where the river's real power was, constantly chewing away at the land. It's a beautiful, poetic way of saying you have to understand and respect the forces of water.
And that proverb really gets us to the heart of the matter today. We're about to challenge some big assumptions. We're going to explore how the very places we count on to absorb water can, when the conditions are just right, become the source of some really immense danger.
So, let's get our key concepts locked in. Water risk. Now, this isn't just about a heavy rainstorm. It's about the ground itself, the soil, the rock, that when it gets totally saturated with water, can just lose its strength. And that can unleash a whole catalog of hazards. This really flips the script from seeing wetlands as only a good thing to understanding their potential for danger.
All right, let's dive into the first category of risks. And these are the big ones, the dramatic, physical forces that get unleashed when the ground itself gives way. This is water not as a life giver, but as a powerful, sometimes terrifying, destructive force. We're going to break down 4 major physical threats here. We'll look at the sudden, explosive violence of flash floods, the unstoppable momentum of landslides, the absolute shock of the ground collapsing beneath your feet, and the slow, grinding power of erosion.
The thing that's so terrifying about a flash flood is the speed. I mean, the Vargas tragedy wasn't some slow-rising river. It was an explosion of water. In just a couple of hours, a tiny little stream became an absolute monster. It's a brutal reminder that when saturated ground can't absorb one more drop, all that water has to go somewhere, and it goes with unbelievable force.
So how does a hillside just let go? Well, the physics are actually devastatingly simple. Think about it in 3 steps. First, water soaks into the soil. Second, it makes that soil incredibly heavy. But third, and this is the crucial part, it acts like a lubricant between all the soil particles, reducing the friction that holds the whole thing together. At that point, it's not really a hillside anymore. It's a ticking clock, and gravity is just waiting for its moment to win.
And that process can lead to something truly nightmarish: liquefaction. Just imagine the ground under a building is totally waterlogged. Then, an earthquake hits. That shaking spikes the pressure, and the water literally pushes the soil grains apart. All of a sudden, the ground isn't solid anymore. It behaves like a thick liquid, and anything sitting on top of it, a building, a bridge, just sinks or tilts or completely collapses.
Now this is a whole different kind of threat. This one happens silently, underground, sometimes over centuries. It's a process called karstic erosion, and it's like a slow-motion monster just eating away at the foundations of the earth from below. Water dissolves rock like limestone, creating these huge invisible voids. And then, one day, with absolutely no warning, the roof just gives way.
Okay, so we've seen the big, dramatic, physical power of saturated ground. But you know, some of the biggest risks are the ones we can't see at all. So let's shift gears and talk about the microscopic and chemical dangers that can travel silently through water.
We can really break this down into 2 main categories. You've got the chemical pollutants that can poison our water sources, and then you have the biological hazards, the diseases that absolutely thrive in these very same wet environments.
You see, the real danger with chemical contamination is that it travels. A factory or a landfill might pollute one specific spot on the map, but as soon as those chemicals get into the groundwater, they can move for miles, unseen. They become this hidden plume of poison, contaminating wells and rivers far, far away from where the problem ever started.
And what's really key here is that different kinds of water create different kinds of dangers. Got a bunch of stagnant ponds and puddles? That's a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, carrying things like malaria and Zika. But a fast-flowing river? Well, that's where you'll find the black flies that transmit river blindness. It just goes to show, any body of water, if it's not managed well, can basically become a factory for disease.
And this brings us to a really modern global risk. We look at wetlands and see these beautiful, peaceful nature preserves. But for migratory birds, they're basically international airports. A bird can pick up a pathogen like H5N1 in Asia,
fly across entire continents, and drop it off in a wetland in Europe or North America. And just like that, a quiet local marsh becomes a critical node in a global pandemic network.
So, we've looked at the physical forces and the invisible biological threats. But now we get to the most important part of this whole story. Because the hazards themselves, they're natural. But the disasters? Oh, those are almost always created by us. This is all about how our own decisions take a natural risk and turn it into a full-blown catastrophe.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? A river overflowing its banks is just a thing that happens in nature. It's a hydrological event. It only, and I mean only, becomes a disaster when we've made the choice to build a town right in its path. That is the crucial difference between a hazard and a disaster.
And this data from Caracas just lays out the consequences in the starkest terms possible. Look at this. Over nearly 30 years, 90% of major landslides happened in these unplanned settlements, often built on super steep, unstable hillsides. Only 10% occurred in properly planned, engineered areas. That's not a coincidence. That is a direct, tragic result of our development choices.
The story of Lake Valencia shows how a single miscalculation can create a crisis that lasts for generations. The mistake was simple, really. Planners saw low water level and thought it was a permanent opportunity for new land. They didn't see it as just one phase in a natural cycle, so they built right on what was basically a temporarily dry lake bed. And when the cycle inevitably reversed and the lake began to rise again, the only fix was to build a giant wall, trapping thousands of people in a basin that is now sitting below the water level of that rising lake. It's a permanent, man-made crisis. And the Orinoco Delta Project is another one of those perfect, tragic examples of good intentions leading to total disaster. The idea seems smart: stop the natural floods to create stable farmland. But they completely misunderstood the ecosystem. Step 1, they stopped the fresh water, which just allowed salt water to rush in, devastating the crops. Step 2, without the annual flood bringing in new nutrients, the soil's fertility plummeted. But here's the final blow, the chemical catastrophe. Those waterlogged soils contained pyrite. When exposed to air, it oxidized and created sulfuric acid, permanently poisoning the very land they were trying to reclaim.
So, after going through all of these physical hazards, these invisible threats, and these massive human miscalculations, what's the big takeaway? Well, it really comes down to a fundamental shift in how we think. We have to learn to live with water, not just constantly fight against it.
Look, it really all boils down to 3 key lessons. First, water is dynamic. The ground under our feet, the riverbanks, they're not static. They're always in motion. Second, nature provides the hazard, but our planning, or our lack of planning, is what creates the disaster. And finally, our most effective defense isn't a bigger concrete wall. It is a deeper understanding of and respect for the natural systems we're a part of.
And all of this brings us to one final question, which is really a challenge for every single one of us. We have the information, the case studies are crystal clear. We understand the dynamics of water risk, so the question for our own communities, for our own cities, is pretty simple. Are we actually planning for these realities, or are we just going to keep building on the dragon's back, just waiting for the disaster to happen?